During the altar call, man, I felt like everyone in that, it was hundreds of people there. I felt like everybody in that church was like pointing to me like, you need to go down and get saved. You know, like that's how convicted I felt. So he asked people to come down, you know, give their life to Christ. And I didn't, because I was like, I didn't want to get saved. I didn't want to be a Christian. I knew I didn't have to be perfect, but I didn't even want to try. Right. You know, I didn't want Jesus to be my Lord. I didn't want to live according to his commandments and teachings or even try. I wanted to do what I wanted to do.
This is Where You're From, an origin story podcast at the intersection of faith and culture that digs into the influences and experiences that shape who we are today. Join us as we gain insight into the Bible's wisdom for all, regardless of where we're from. Hey y'all, this is Rasool Berry. Thanks for joining me on Where You're From. This week, I'm talking with none other than sports analyst, commentator, and broadcaster, Chris Broussard. You may have seen him on ESPN or Fox Sports 1, or maybe you've heard him on numerous radio programs, but you have never heard him like this. We do a deep dive into his life, from his family history and his childhood in Cincinnati to the emptiness of success, which sent him looking for more. You can find out more about Chris, including K.I.N.G Ministries, which he founded, in the show notes or by visiting whereyou'refrom.org. That's whereyafrom.org. Please join me as I ask Chris Broussard where you're from.
Well, first of all, man, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And where I'm from, I was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And my family roots are in Louisiana, African American of Creole descent, which is like really a mixture of African ancestry and French. But in doing my DNA, I found out I have all types of European blood in me to go along with the African. So it's not just French. But yeah, so from Louisiana, moved as a baby to Cincinnati, Ohio, because my father grew up in Cincinnati. My mother was born in Baton Rouge. My father was born in Opelousas, Louisiana, which is a little town in Louisiana. But my father and my mother met at Xavier University, which is an HBCU in New Orleans. And the way they met was, you know, they were freshmen and there was a dance, a school dance, and Xavier's a Catholic school, the only Catholic HBCU, I believe. Yep. And the nuns asked all the girls to put their shoe in the center of the room. And the guys were supposed to pick a shoe, and whoever shoe you picked, you would dance with. So my father's like 5'6" inches tall. So he said he picked the smallest shoe he could find, and it was my mom's, and she's 4'8". So wow. Yeah, so I'm 5'10". I'm like the giant in my household. I don't know how I got to be this big. But yeah, so that's how my parents met. But my father, even though he was born in Louisiana, he grew up in Cincinnati. His father, my grandfather, had a 6th grade education and was in the Army, World War II. And he met some African Americans there from the North. And they were all telling him, man, you got to get your family out of the South. You know, get up north when you can. And my father actually was born while my grandfather was in World War II. My grandfather, being that he spoke Creole, he served as an interpreter in World War II with the French, because it was close to French, obviously. But anyway, when my grandfather came back to Louisiana, he walked into a store and the store owner called him Tay-Nig, which in French meant little N-word, little N-word. And my grandfather said, you know what, that's it. You know, I'm getting out of here. I'm taking my family up north.
And this is after he came back from fighting for the freedom for America.
Yep.
Fighting against tyranny, against racism, ostensibly. And then he comes back home.
And is racially oppressed. Exactly. So he took the train up to Cincinnati because it was the first stop after the Mason-Dixon line. And he got out and found a cab driver, black cab driver, said, take me where the colored folk live. And he went, Cincinnati, got a job as a cement finisher, bought an apartment. And once he got settled, after a few months, he went back down to Louisiana and got my father and my grandmother. And that's why my father grew up in Cincinnati. Ohio, and his 3 siblings, 1 sister and 2 brothers, they all grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. And my grandfather, who had this 6th grade education, my grandmother, I think, had a 10th grade education through hard work. My grandfather worked 2 jobs. My grandmother never worked. And then when he stopped working 2 jobs, he still was working 1, obviously, as a cement finisher. But he took correspondence courses through the mail of how to build TVs and repair television sets. This was the 1950s, how to repair and build television sets. So once he went through that, he started his own TV repair business. Wow. And eventually was able to just do television repair full time. But through that, he put 4 kids through college, and they all went to Xavier in New Orleans. And then through those 4, there are 8 of us who are their grandchildren. We've all been through college and graduated, and all are doing well. And I use that story a lot to teach people how you can change the destiny of your family. And my grandfather, through faith and hard work and through courage to leave the South and migrate up north, was able to change the destiny of his family. And there's no way I would be where I'm at as a broadcaster for Fox Sports if it weren't for the sacrifices and the hard work and the courage that my grandfather had and made.
Wow. Man, that is an amazing story. And there were so many pieces that I got to kind of jump in and get a little bit more of the nooks and crannies. So first, the other thing that was just kind of interesting was just that sense of a desire for better for his family, and even being exposed to that by having his horizons opened by other troops that were with him that said, you don't have to live in these kind of oppressive conditions. But then the fact that literally the story of race in America has shaped who you are, like down to like where your folks are from and all that. So,
absolutely.
So we didn't even got to where you grew up yet.
Right. I was born in Baton Rouge. My father was in the Vietnam War while I was born. And so when he came home, I wasn't even a year old. My father, as I said, graduated from Xavier University. I think his degree was in business administration. And so my father, he was in that first group of African Americans who graduated from college after affirmative action was, just enacted. And so he worked with the government for a few years and then eventually got a job at Travelers Insurance Company in corporate America, in that first group of African Americans to really get those jobs. So he worked in Cincinnati. So we lived in Cincinnati, Ohio from the time I was younger than a year old until I was 7 years old.
Okay.
And Travelers kept transferring him. He got promoted, but he kept getting transferred to different cities. So when I was 7, we moved from Cincinnati, Ohio to Indianapolis, Indiana. And then after 4.5 years there, we moved to Syracuse, New York when I was in the 7th grade. After a year and a half there, we moved to Des Moines, Iowa.
Wow.
Where I started high school, believe it or not, in Des Moines, Iowa. We were there for 2.5 years. And then late in my junior year of high school, we moved to Cleveland, Ohio. And so I graduated from high school in Cleveland and went to college, Oberlin College, near Cleveland, about 45 minutes west of Cleveland. But now Louisiana, we would go to Louisiana almost every summer and drive down and stay with family and relatives. And so I did experience a lot of Louisiana.
Okay, hold on for a sec. I've been to New Orleans several times, and I would say it is the most richly unique culture in Louisiana in the country in terms of just the confluence of different cultures. I'm curious about how you experienced that growing up, especially now that you've lived in other places. Maybe you can appreciate it more. So for those who've never been around the bayou, right? Like, help us get a sense of what that was like what you saw, smelled, experienced in Louisiana.
Yeah, obviously the food, beignet, gumbo, jambalaya, boudin. But yeah, so when I was in Louisiana, I was in Baton Rouge, but also Opelousas, Lake Charles, and New Orleans to some degree. But so my mother's side, my grandfather, it's hard to say he was lighter than me, but he's light like me or lighter than me. And he could easily have passed for a white man. but he wasn't. He was black. And my grandmother, his wife, was brown skinned. And I asked him once, "Are you Creole?" And he said, I don't want to say what he said. He's like, "No, I ain't Creole," you know. And so but I'm guessing he was, because his last name was Beauregard, but he did not claim to be Creole. He just claimed to be black. Those grandparents have interesting stories as well. They both graduated from Southern University in Baton Rouge, which is an HBCU down there. And so they were both very active in the NAACP and all that. But on that side of my family, I did not really experience any type of Creole influence.
Right.
We just considered, it was just black. My grandmother, her background was Baptist. My grandfather was Catholic, but she converted to Catholicism when she got married to him. But we still would go to the Baptist churches. But on my father's side, yes, when we were out in the country in Opelousas with him, at times in New Orleans, we saw more of the Creole influence. But I'm going to be honest, for myself, growing up north or in the Midwest, I just thought of myself and was raised as just black. So I really am not rooted like I grew up experiencing the Creole culture. I just was black, and that's how I was raised. That's how we thought of ourselves. And some of my other cousins, certainly the ones who grew up in Louisiana, and they, had a strong black identity as well, but they were raised more in the Creole culture and seeing some of that too.
Gotcha. And then rewinding, because identity formation is interesting, right? Because it's a factor of what's around you and also how people perceive you.
Absolutely.
So do you remember the earliest moment of being like, "Oh, I'm black," or like where that became an important aspect of understanding who you were based on people's maybe responses around you even?
My first recollections of race, my father was very pro-black.
Okay.
And I mean pro-black, like just proud to be black. That was just instilled in me. I never had any insecurity or inferiority complex about being black at all. And I'm thankful for that, because I know a lot of African Americans have grown up with that type of kind of complex because of the racism. But I never felt it because my father was very pro-black. That's the way I was raised. And I don't mean he didn't know or teach me a lot of black history. I mean, he did civil rights marches down when he was in college in Louisiana and all that. It was more of almost a popular culture. I mean, in sports, we always were pulling, not unlike most African Americans, but we always pulled for the team with the black quarterback, or the team with the black coach. Black music was big in our household. It was just embedded in us. I mean, everybody was a brother, the brothers this, the brothers that, And so I started at a public school, but then in second grade, I went to a Catholic school in Cincinnati. And Cincinnati, I didn't know it at the time. I'm a kid, but it was, has had obviously a racist history.
Yeah.
So I went to this Catholic school. The public school I've been at was probably majority black. I went to this Catholic school that was all white. I think there were 3 blacks, myself, my brother, and this other brother named Benji. And, but anyway, on the bus, we would get teased by the older kids. We took the bus to school and back home. And some of the older kids, like 4th, 5th, 6th graders, would tease us. Me and my brother, we had afros. They were just always teasing us about being black. Now, the kids in my class were cool. I developed some good friendships. But the older kids during recess, 4th graders would tease me. And so I got in a couple fights that were race-based with the older kids. So, yeah, those are some of my earliest recollections of race. And I tell people I haven't calculated. I don't keep track.
Right.
But I've said to people, honestly, I don't think there's a day in my life that I haven't thought about race. Not always negative, mostly not negative, but just you walk into a room, I'm the only black person there. Or how many brothers are in here? How many other black people? Just whatever the situation, race in some form or fashion has crossed my mind probably every day of my life since I've had a memory.
And, just to hear the context of your grandfather's experience, at World War II, your dad's experience in Vietnam, and then your experience, like this aspect of like it being part of this conflict and this challenge that you've, through no fault of your own, just found yourself in the midst of.
Right.
But another thing that you mentioned that, I'm curious about, there's so much of these kind of mixture of different experiences. And you talked about from a faith standpoint, some of your family being Catholic, some being Baptist, you kind of being in all of these different environments. I'm curious about, when did you start to have a sense of personal faith in Christ and start walking with him? I don't know if that was as a kid or if that was later in life, but like, when did you first start thinking about this and being like, yo, this is important to me?
Right. Well, I grew up Catholic, as I said, and we went to church every Sunday, no matter what, pretty much. And I went to Catholic schools from second grade through high school. My father, believe it or not, actually studied. He went to seminary for 2 years during high school to become a priest, a Catholic priest. So he was in seminary from his sophomore and junior years of high school. And race keeps coming up, but we've lived in a racist country. So anyway, he's in seminary. Things are going well. He's one of maybe 5 African Americans out of 150 boys and stuff like that. And he played sports, was popular, had friends, all that. And one day when he was a junior, a freshman asked him, "Why are you so dark?" And he said, "Maybe it's because I'm colored." At that time, colored was the phrase they used. And he said later, like that day going forward, everything changed. The way people treated him. Wow. Guys he was friends with were shunning him. He would walk up, they having a conversation, they would stop talking or they would walk away. Now, these are guys who were studying to be priests.
Wow. So they had assumed that
they thought he was white. Yeah. They thought he was white.
Wow.
And he said even some of the administration just were treating him differently. And so after 2 weeks of this, being shunned, getting the cold shoulder, all that, from people he had been cool with, he called his dad and mom, and he lived, he'd been living in the dorms at the seminary. They came up and he got in the car, they're talking, he's crying with my grandparents and he's telling them what happened. And my grandfather, Burley, said, "Son, everybody's not meant to be Jackie Robinson. Come on home." And so that ended my father's quest to become a Catholic priest, which I'm glad he did not become a Catholic priest. Because as you know, I wouldn't be here, right? They don't get married. So that's a little bit of religious background. My grandparents were devout Catholics, if you will.
Got it.
And so I was raised Catholic. And so when I went to college, I was a Catholic, but I didn't know anything about having a personal relationship with Christ. I was interested in God, obviously, and I did pray. And I remember at times thinking, man, I wish I knew God's will. Like, I wish I knew what God really wanted me to do, things like that, how he wanted me to live, how he wants us to live. And it's interesting. My first girlfriend in college was Buddhist to the point where every morning and every evening before dinner, she would get up and chant. She had a gahonzon, was a little wooden shrine, and she put fruit and incense and all that in front of it and chant. I did it with her once, but I didn't dabble other than that. I didn't dabble into Buddhism. But I would pray most nights. So my sophomore year in college, I began dating a woman who was a Christian. She had converted her freshman year, or it might have been her sophomore year, and, had stopped doing a lot of the things that college students do because she was trying to follow Christ, And so when we started dating, she was really the first close friend I had that exposed me to biblical Christianity. I played on the basketball team. There were a couple guys on the basketball team who were Christians. One of them I was a fairly good friend with. He lived next door to me, and he was a Christian. I gotta be honest, I didn't know anything about biblical Christianity. like, because when we would go to the Baptist churches with my grandmother, we were really going to the concerts that my cousins were performing at, their concerts. So when I started dating her, she kind of exposed me to biblical Christianity because, she was going to the Bible studies on campus, actually led by this brother that was on the hoop team. And she would, want to pray. So she would say, let's pray. And so when we would pray, because I was open, I thank God that I had a soft heart, and I was open to prayer. But when we prayed, I noticed the big difference because when she prayed, it was like she was praying to somebody she knew, like a brother or father, a friend, she was praying to God like she had this relationship with him. Those are things that opened me up to biblical Christianity. But we were dating for a year and a half before I got saved. It was a constant tug of war because I wasn't trying to live for Christ. And she was. Even though we had a great relationship and good times, it was this constant tension, right? And so she ended up going to medical school nearby, like about an hour away. And so we stayed together and we would visit each other on weekends. And one weekend we went to a church. It was a charismatic church. I hadn't seen anything like that. They had the lyrics to the songs on the wall, on the big screen, right? Everybody's up, excited about God and singing and praising and, just excited. And I had never, being Catholic, with all due respect, I was just used to boring, solemn services. Like, I'm used to sitting in there daydreaming, counting the minutes till it's over. Real talk, because the people were so huggy. Yeah. And I was like, this is nice, but like you said, but strange, you know what I mean? And so they had a guest speaker that day and he shared his testimony. He had been addicted to drugs as a teenager and got saved at 16, I believe. And God turned his life around. And for some reason, that just being in that atmosphere, hearing his message, that's the first time I really remember being convicted of my sin, like to the point where I knew God wasn't pleased with my lifestyle. And like my lifestyle wasn't pleasing to God. And I was willfully going against his will. Because I was taught as a Catholic, I was taught the 10 Commandments and various things like that. And I knew I was breaking a lot of, like, just willfully doing what I wanted to do, regardless of what God had said to do. And so that day, they had the altar call. And during the altar call, man, I felt like everyone in that, it was hundreds of people there. I felt like everybody in that church was like pointing to me like, you need to go down against that, like that's how convicted I felt. So he asked people to come down, give their life to Christ. And I didn't, because I was like, I didn't want to get saved. I didn't want to be a Christian. I knew I didn't have to be perfect, but I didn't even want to try. Right. I didn't want Jesus to be my Lord. I didn't want to live according to his commandments and teachings or even try. I wanted to do what I wanted to do. My boys, my frat brothers, nobody other than, like I said, a couple dudes on the hoop team that I really didn't even understand why they were living the way. I didn't know no brothers that were trying to live for the Lord. You know what I mean? Like I knew dudes that prayed. I knew dudes that went to church, but really seeking the Lord, right? Trying to live for the Lord. I ain't knowing. I was like, man, shoot. I ain't about to be the only one doing this. You know what I mean? And so I went back to school and, doing my thing. And that summer, God still blessed me. I had a summer internship at the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper, which was the biggest newspaper in Ohio at the time. It still may be. And I had an internship in sports writing. Did well in that. And they told me a few weeks before I was going back to school, look, you did a great job. When you graduate, we're going to hire you in a year from now. So, I'm on top of the world. You're heading into your senior year. You have this promise of this job waiting for you, a good job that's going to pay you well, a fun job in sports writing. Like I was on top of the world. And after a few days of just that, being excited and all that, I really began to feel like, man, is this like all that life's about? Because I was raised to believe like life is about the American dream. Right. Go to school, Chris, get good grades so you can go to a good college. go to a good college so you can get a good job, and take care of your family. Like that was what I was raised to believe was essentially the point of life. And here I was now with that within my grasp, like, man, I got it. I got a good job. I'm going to have a good job. It's within my grasp. I can see it. I've got the American dream. So feeling that way, I just ultimately began to be like, man, is this all that life's about? And I began to feel empty. Like, man, there's got to be more to life than this. And I knew it was Christ because I had been convicted months earlier and was running from the Lord. But like I said, I still didn't want to get saved, didn't want to give my life to Christ. And so I'm looking for loopholes, every loophole in the book. I'm looking for ways I can find some peace and some joy without giving my life to Christ, because I was really feeling empty inside, even though I had everything going for me. I had a promise of a job, girlfriend I love, things going well at school, all that.
That's the interesting thing about your story is that, like, on the one end, you see the story, this testimony of this person that overcame addiction at church, and you're seeing that kind of bring that person to a strong faith. But in your case, it wasn't like you hit rock bottom. It was actually quite the opposite. Like you had reached this mountaintop of like, hey, I know what I'm going to be doing next year, and it's exactly what I want to do. And it just feels empty.
Man,
like that's it.
I wasn't wealthy or rich or anything, but I felt like I had what I wanted. Right. And I still wasn't satisfied, still wasn't content, because that void in every person's heart, because Ecclesiastes says God's put eternity in our heart. So I tell people that when I speak, like, don't sell out God to get wealth or fame or something, because that's not going to satisfy you anyway. So why would you go against God for something that's not going to satisfy you?
When we come back, we will hear how Chris's success led to a coveted offer of a lifetime to be a national sports reporter for the New York Times, which he shockingly refused. That's coming next on Where You're From.
This episode is brought to you by Church Law and Tax. Church Law and Tax understands the realities of church work, helping thousands of churches stay informed and get equipped with comprehensive resources on legal, tax, financial, and risk management matters. Do you have a question on housing allowance? Need information on selecting church insurance? Looking for insights on what is or isn't unrelated business income? Or how about some guidance on how to properly receive charitable contributions? ChurchLawAndTax.com equips you for success with access to the most respected and knowledgeable attorneys, accountants, financial advisors, and risk managers guiding churches today. Get the practical information and timely coverage you need to keep your church up to date and lead your ministry with confidence. Join ChurchLawAndTax.com today.
Hey y'all, before we get back to our conversation with Chris Broussard, I wanted to share a quick teaser from our next episode with Duke Kwon. This is Where You're From.
That to me is really, really important in terms of being not just willing to, but eager to connect with people across difference, and to do so, again, not in a patronizing way, but in a way where I expect to benefit and where I expect them to be a source of my learning as well. I think that keeps us humble. It means every time you go in, you're going in as a learner, not just a teacher. You're going in as a receiver and not just a corrector of all the ways that they've got things wrong.
Now let's get back into our conversation with Chris Broussard on Where You're From.
So was there a moment in which, after that pursuit of all the things and trying to find loopholes and other ways that was there like a specific moment where you were like, all right, Lord, it's you, or was it more of a gradual transition?
Nah, it was a moment. Like, cause I was looking, I looked at all types of stuff, read a story in Rolling Stone magazine. Remember Bobby Brown was married to Whitney Houston. He was hot. That was 1989. He was the man, right?
My prerogative.
My prerogative, Tenderoni, Don't Be Cruel, all that. I remember him saying in the article, he was happier, as I remember, he was happier when he was poor than when he's rich, because all the problems money brought. I remember watching a movie on TV about Elvis Presley, how he had everything and he was miserable and addicted to drugs. And I was like, man, these dudes had everything. They had even more, way more than I had. All the money, all the fame, all the women you could want. And they weren't happy and they weren't content. So after looking at all these things, it was my 21st birthday. We had a scrimmage that day, the basketball team. My parents came up to watch. And after that, they brought me home because they were taking me and my girlfriend out to dinner. It was going to be my 21st birthday. So before we went out, we were at home. My father and I went to run some errands. And I was like, Daddy, what keeps you going in life? Like, I wasn't suicidal or anything, but I just was feeling empty inside. And I was like, what keeps you going, like, in life? Like, you got 2 boys. They're both in college doing well. You got a nice house. Once you get all that, what keeps you going in life? And it was like, well, you want a promotion on your job, or you want a bigger house or a nicer car, or you want to make money to help others. Like, it was good stuff, but I knew, I was like, man, none of that is going to fill this void that I'm feeling in my heart. So believe it or not, that day before we went out to eat, they brought me a cake and, you're supposed to make a wish and all that. Instead of making a wish, I prayed inside. I didn't tell them, but I gave my life to Christ. I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior and asked him to fill me with his Holy Spirit. And I surrendered my life to Christ so my natural birthday is my spiritual birthday as well.
Wow, that's powerful. So you also introduced in that part of your story another love in your life of sport. So to take a page out of love in basketball, right? And its corollary, brown sugar. When did you fall in love with basketball?
Oh, man. Well, and let me say this quickly, because most times I tell this story and I forget to say this and people are like, well, what happened to the girl?
Yeah.
We got married and we've been married.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. So we've been married 27 years.
Wow.
And we have twin daughters. So we've been blessed.
See, I was afraid to ask because I ain't wanted to be like,
right.
We broke up. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to leave that alone.
But I forget to say it. Then people like, so what happened to the girl?
Wow.
But anyway, basketball, man, believe it or not, my first love was football. I mean, sports was like a huge part of my life. Like, sports was everything to me growing up, to be honest. And so growing up in Cincinnati as a young kid, football was number one. I wanted to be the next great tailback. Started playing tackle football when I was 8. And then, to be honest, my second love was baseball. In Cincinnati, you had the Cincinnati Reds in the 70s. They were great. The Big Red Machine with Johnny Bench and Joe Morgan and all those guys, Pete Rose. And at that time, and it saddens me that this has become the case, but African Americans were much more into baseball back in the day. Now it's probably pretty much viewed as a white sport or a white and Hispanic, but African Americans aren't playing it much. But back then, man, the leagues we played in, tons of black kids playing, black coaches, football and baseball were my first 2 loves. And basketball, of course, I liked, but we wasn't playing it much. And so when I moved to Indianapolis at age 7, right before I turned 8, Indiana basketball is huge.
Yeah.
And that's when I began playing more basketball. But football was my best sport. I wanted to play football in college. And my senior year, I played most of my football season with a hip pointer. I was a wide receiver, but I had a hip pointer. I played, but it was hindering my speed a little bit and stuff. And I had a much better year in basketball. I had a good year in football. We made the state playoffs and I started, and, we did well. But basketball, I had a really great year. Played in the Greater Cleveland All-Star game where they had the best seniors in the area play and ended up being recruited. I was recruited Division III, so smaller schools.
Okay. Right.
But I was recruited in football and basketball in very similar schools, sometimes the same schools. Oberlin College recruited me for both. But even though football was still my favorite sport my senior year, football got more and more painful the older you got. Like, really. And I felt by the time I was done my senior year, like I said, I had a hip pointer throughout most of the year. So that was painful. But I was to the point in college where I was like, if I could just play in the games and not practice, I would play football. Right. But I was like, you know what? I'm just going to play basketball. And so I played basketball at Oberlin. And I love football and basketball probably equally, even to this day. But what happened was, as a sports writer, I was covering high school sports initially. And that I covered all the sports, every season, from volleyball to soccer to wrestling to track to obviously football, basketball, and baseball. And then the sport that my newspaper I was at, the Akron Beacon-Journal, promoted me from high school sports to covering the NBA, to covering the Cleveland Cavaliers. And so that's how I became a basketball writer. And because I played in college, people did associate me even more with basketball, like writers and other media. And when I talked to people, and so I kind of became known as just a basketball guy. But if they had promoted me to covering baseball or football, I may have ended up, becoming a guy known for one of those sports.
Gotcha. So at this point, you start with the bang, being associated with the largest newspapers in the state of Ohio. When does the next big moment happen that kind of catapults you in your career? You know
what was interesting? I actually began teaching seminars on Blacks in the Bible. And so honestly, I felt a strong calling to go into the ministry. I had a burden for men, for the Black community, and I wanted to get them to Christ, And so I was doing a lot of ministry out in the streets, in the projects, speaking places, rapping, I used to rap and all that. And so I felt like I really didn't think I was going to be a sports writer for more than 5 years, honestly. And I actually applied to several seminaries, was accepted, and was planning on going. And it just never worked out for one reason or another. And God had another plan. So what happened was I'm covering high school sports for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And my wife was my fiance at that time. She was in medical doing her residency in Baltimore. So I was in Cleveland. She was in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins University. So I was doing work and ministry. That was what I was doing. So 94, I left the Cleveland Plain Dealer and went to the Akron Beacon-Journal. And so when I went there after covering high schools for a few months, they gave me my break. First, they had me covering the Cleveland Indians for a few months in 1995. I was a backup beat writer, and I was at all the games, went to the playoffs. They went to the World Series that year, and I was doing all the sidebar stories on them. And then after that, right after I got married, they promoted me to covering the Cleveland Cavaliers. And so that's where I got my first big break. In 1995-96 season, I covered the NBA. I covered the Cavs, and then covered them the next season. And then after 2 years, the New York Times called me. And they had seen, my stuff, what I wrote about. They liked it, my reporting. And they were interested in me working there. And so I went, interviewed with the New York Times. They liked me. They said, they come back a month from now. We'll do the second interview. But they were clearly very interested. And so when I started covering the NBA, all that ministry I was doing, which was extensive, it stopped because I was working every day. My first year on the Cavaliers, I worked 188 straight days.
Wow.
I didn't know enough to be like, I need a day off. I was just a young gung-ho and going to every practice, every game. I'm on the road. That's 41 games a year, but that's more than 41 days on the road. You're there overnight. And so I wasn't doing any ministry. And I felt that burden though, and so I was praying about it and I was like, man, I feel called to the ministry. But I didn't really necessarily feel called to be a pastor. You know what I mean? But I didn't know. I was like, I guess I'll be a pastor, but I know I just feel called. So I called the New York Times after about a week or two after I had done an interview with them. And I said, I appreciate your interest in me. Obviously, you have a great newspaper and all that. But, I'm going into the full-time Christian ministry. And I don't want to waste your time with a second interview. And, of course, they're like baffled, like, what? And then I told the Akron Beacon-Journal, where I was covering the Cavaliers, I told them what happened. And I told them look, since I'm going into the ministry, I'm not trying to progress as a sports writer. I'd like you to take me off the Cavs beat. And I was enrolled. I was set. I was going to go to Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. I had gone out there and met with the people. I was visiting seminaries when I was traveling with the Cavs.
Wow.
And they put out the Akron Beacon Journal, took me off the Cavs beat and put me on the University of Akron. Because I was like, since I'm not trying to progress, go further, I don't want to travel as much. So I was enrolled in Fuller, set to go. My wife had actually gotten a job out there in the medical field. And then she got pregnant with twins. And so we're like, man, because I was going to leave my job and just be a full-time student. She wasn't at the point where, you know, she was making a lot of money as a doctor. She wasn't going to be. And so we prayed about it and honestly thought about it, you know, just thought too and talked about it. And, you know, we decided, you know what, I'll put off seminary. Then I'm thinking, man, shoot, I probably should have went to the New York Times. You know what I mean? And almost a year to the day that I had told them I wasn't interested, the sports editor for New York Times calls me out of the blue. It seemed to me like he was being spiritual because he knew where I was coming from. He's like, Chris, I was out jogging today and the birds were chirping and the sky was blue and the sun was shining and something said to me, call Chris Broussard. And he said, are you still going to seminary? And I said, yeah, but not for 2 or 3 years. It's going to be a few years from now. And he said, well, why don't you come work for the New York Times until you go? And my wife's from New York City, so I'm excited, you know, so I'm like, all right, cool. So I go back out for the second round of interviews. And this time I'm meeting with people from all the departments, editorial departments, and the head honchos at the New York Times. And to be honest, there was no pressure because I knew they wanted me. It was awesome because it was like most of the conversations were about my faith or racial issues because they knew I had turned it down a year before to go into the ministry. So people were talking to me about faith. The Million Man March had happened just recently. They were asking me about that. One guy, black guy who was there, one of the head execs, he said, you're going to add to our diversity at the New York Times. And I said, why? Because I'm black? He was like, nah, because you're a Christian. You know, and so it was really an opportunity to let God just use me. And so I was at the New York Times for 6 years, from 1998 to 2004. And then I went to ESPN, the magazine. But they said, look, we've seen you on television because I'd been on various ESPN shows as a writer for the New York Times. And they said, we like you on TV. We'll use you, you know, here and there. And as time went on, I just became doing more and more and more television. And so when I left ESPN in 2016, started out writing for the magazine and doing some stuff for ESPN.com, and then gradually just became more of a TV personality. By the time I left in 2016, I was not writing much at all. So I left ESPN in 2016 to go to Fox Sports because Fox Sports was offering me a job as an opinionist or a commentator rather than trying to break news and chase news. And that was more appealing to me. And so I went to Fox Sports and, you know, began doing television there and then began doing radio. And now I have a daily national radio show and a daily national television show. And so I've been at Fox Sports since 2016.
Amazing. Wow, that's an amazing story. And it's something about for someone working at Akron to turn them down proactively and say, no thanks, there's something else. That had to shock everybody because that's the dream for most journalists. But I think it must have did something in your own soul to realize, okay, this is the moment of truth. Like this is the scenario where I have the world at my fingertips. Am I going to choose that or am I going to choose the Lord? And so I imagine that must have been a very formative experience even for your own sense. And then to see, oh, God worked it out. He brought it back.
Right.
I didn't have to fight for it. And they called you.
Right. And I still, when I went there, was feeling like this is temporary, you know, like, and there were times, I think maybe 2 more times where I had applied to seminaries, thought I was going to go, been accepted, visited seminaries.
Yeah.
And again, it didn't work out because I had a family to take care of,
You're right.
you know, and ultimately I realized, you know, God has given me a platform I never would have had coming out of seminary.
Yeah.
You know, I'm able to be a light, an example, and a witness to people who may never go to church, who may be antagonistic toward Christianity. And to be honest, I've spoken at some of the biggest churches in America because of sports. I mean, I speak about God, but they are interested in me because I'm a national sports figure, you know, and that one thing I've been blessed with, Rasool, is that I have a wide range of Christian fellowship because of sports, because everybody's into sports, right?
Right.
So I've spoken at Black churches, Hispanic churches, white churches, multiracial churches, Catholic, Pentecostal, Baptist. You know, most Christians, most, not all, but most Christians who have a wide range of fellowship, racially, it's still theologically, they're still in their camp, Reformed or Word of Faith, or, you know what I mean? Like, they're speaking with people of other races and ethnicities within that kind of strain of Christianity.
Right.
But I'm actually have spoken at all types of churches.
And I see behind you, you have your backsplash with the word King on it.
Yes.
K.I.N.G. Tell us about King, what it is, why you started it, and what those letters mean.
Yeah, well, the precursor to King, I had started a group in Cleveland, Ohio, just to kind of strengthen men in their walks with life for 2 reasons, really. One, myself, I think males and females for that matter, but males long for male bonding or need male bonding, and females need female bonding. Fraternities, gangs, lodges, sports. So my best memories, as much as I love playing the actual sport, some of my best memories are in the locker room, on the bus. You know what I mean? Like the interaction and fellowship and bonding with your teammates. And so I longed when I became a Christian. Like I said, I didn't know many Bible-believing Christians. I was in a good church, but most of the guys were older than me, married, you know what I mean? And so I longed for that male bonding in Christ. I wanted bonding where we weren't even necessarily talking about God, but I was with brothers, whether we're talking about hip hop, we're talking about sports or whatever culture, but that loved the Lord, that would encourage me in my walk with the Lord. So that was one reason. The other was that I saw brothers. As I began to meet young brothers around the city of Cleveland that were saved, I saw a lot of them, their walk was like a roller coaster. I met brothers who had gotten saved in things like Teen Challenge, where they went to get off drugs, and, you know, that's Bible-based ministry, and they became strong in the Lord, or brothers that got saved in prison or whatever, and other ones who didn't have as, you know, that type of dramatic story, but still I was meeting brothers that were saved, and I saw several, their walks were like on fire for 6 months and then out for a year. On fire for a year, out for 6 months. And some of the reason for that I saw was because they didn't really have that male bonding in Christ. Like the only cats they really kicked it with were their boys who weren't saved, you know? So I said, man, I really want to get young men. I was 21 years old, 21, 22, 23 years old. I want to get young men my age that love the Lord together, so we can hang out, kick it, strengthen each other, all that. And so I started a group in Cleveland. We were doing that on a local level. We were ministering. We had rappers. We did all types of stuff and just hang out. And so when I started covering the NBA, went to the New York Times and all this stuff, that burden to reach men with the gospel never really left me. And so as I'm progressing in my career, I'm thinking like, man, how can I do this? Because it still was in me to want to do it. And ultimately, you know, I started putting down some ideas. I wanted, you know, a name that was masculine. And I wanted an acronym. So I thought, man, King obviously is a great masculine name. And then the acronym is knowledge, inspiration, and nurture through God. And so I was a group of brothers from my church that I knew and other places that were Christians. And I talked to them, started talking to them about King, started sharing with them the ideas I had for it and all that. And a couple were gung-ho. And so we started out with just a prayer call. And then gradually it grew to where we got a website. We starting local chapters in various cities. And again, people knowing me, nationally, that helped. We have roughly 20 chapters throughout the country. We have obviously a website, kingmovement.com. We have paraphernalia, hats, hoodies, sweatshirts, T-shirts, wristbands. We have a summit, a men's conference every year. We call it the King National Summit. And so we've done events at Morehouse College, other HBCUs. We work with the NFL during Super Bowl to do an event at these HBCUs where we speak to hundreds of high school and college age young men about faith and about other aspects of life that can help them grow into fathers and husbands and leaders. So we've had several NFL Hall of Famers and former players, NBA former players, and current sometimes speak at our events. God has blessed it to really grow and prosper, but we even got a long way to go.
No, that's dope. And I also think about how the scriptures don't run away from sports analogies and examples as well. In 1 Corinthians 9:24, do you not know that in a race, all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it.
Right.
Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable. Paul is like intertwining this example to say, look at, this is 2,000 years ago and it's still the same thing. Like, look at what these athletes go through and commit themselves to. Let that be an example to us about how we should go hard for God.
Man,
and
real talk.
Is that something that you see that those parallels to when you're exposed to the best athletes in the world?
Yeah, completely. For me, that scripture really was a challenge to me when my brother was in the Nation of Islam. He's out now, but seeing him so committed. He was committed. He was almost living an ascetic lifestyle, and I was like, man, all he's given up, all he's doing for his faith, how much more should I go hard for Christ? So that really led me to study and learn more. But yeah, in sports, you're right. When you think about what these athletes go through, the dedication that they have to their craft, we should apply that dedication to our faith.
Yeah. So I'm going to get you out of here on this. We talked about, and I think for good reason, the spiritual insights that we can gain from sports. But I also want to give you an opportunity to speak to the other side of that. Like, you've seen the importance of putting Christ above sports and ways in which sometimes that gets lost.
Look, man, obviously I love sports. Sports that's how I've made my living. It's enabled me to provide for my family, put 2 daughters through college, have a great lifestyle. So it's been great for me. But honestly, I think sports in America has become idolatry. You can literally do nothing but watch sports, like be involved in sports. Like, you cannot pay attention to the news, to what else is going on in life. Like, there are enough outlets now where you can totally be immersed in sports outside of whatever your job is. You can totally be immersed in sports and really know nothing else as an adult. The obviously outlandish amounts of money that the athletes make, which I don't fault them at all. They're just making their fair share, at least. They get about 50% roughly of what the sport generates. So we as a society, but anybody wants to say, we paying the athletes this much money. The society, that's the amount of money we spend on the sports. So don't blame the athletes. That's a reflection of our society. So I think in a lot of ways it's become idolatry and led people away from things that, I think, again, sports is great, but it should be kept in a proper perspective. And so Christ, obviously, is the only thing that's going to fulfill you.
This is Where You're From. I'm Rasool Berry, and remember, it's not just about where you're at, it's also about where you're from. This show was produced by Ryan Clevenger, Mary Jo Clark, and Jade Gussman, and was engineered by Gabrielle Bauer and Kevin Burgess. I also want to thank Caleb and Keno for their help in supporting and promoting Where You're From. Thanks, y'all. Where You're From is part of the Voices collection from Our Daily Bread Ministries.